Africa Prime, brought to you by Jamison Select Reserve.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of Africa Prime. Tonight we are joined by Matola. He's the CEO of Brand South Africa. Now, he was appointed to that position on the 1st of April in 2010, and before that, for 4 years, he had been CEO of the Durban International Convention Center, and during that stint, he was recognized by South African Airways as one of the tourism promoters in that province. And also before that, he was CEO of KwaZulu-Natal province. So he's very much a man steeped in the tourism industry and in the business of promotion of tourism around the country. Mila, thank you for finding time to talk to us.
Good evening, Godfrey. Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with the basic question. How do you value a brand, particularly the brand of a country?
Well, in evaluating a country brand, the methodology we use is really a methodology that's drawn from the UK-based brand finance. What they take into account would be the GDP of the country, obviously, and looking at the output in terms of the firms within the country. And they use a discount rate to arrive at what is a figure for the value of that country brand, for example.
So what is the value of Brand South Africa?
South Africa's current value is around 149 billion US dollars. And that's really still what we believe a conservative estimate, but based on the calculations that were done for 2011.
And how has that value been like in terms of, I'm trying to get a sense of whether it's been increasing, it's been decreasing, and in fact, I'm trying to mark you, let's put it that way.
Well, Godfrey, if you look at the previous year, 2010, we're looking at a valuation of just under 140, around 135 billion US dollars to be precise. And so the movement up to around 149 is actually a significant improvement on the brand value.
Well, I suppose this is coming at a time when the economy, as we know, has been battling a global recession, and therefore it represents indeed a good mark for you. Perhaps let's leave that conversation there. But let's just look at the work that you're doing in terms of trying to promote Brand South Africa. Now, we know the World Cup was probably one of the biggest opportunities for South Africa to rebrand itself in terms of increasing and making its stature in the world look much better. How much did the World Cup add?
Godfrey, the World Cup really helped to change long-standing misperceptions about Africa, the continent, as well as South Africa. Sure. What it did is it gave us a huge marketing opportunity, gave the world a window into South Africa, and in that way changed perceptions significantly about what South Africa stands for, but more importantly, what South Africa can offer as a country, as an economy.
Some people say that you couldn't put a value to it. Could you put a value to it? I know we spent maybe north of 40 billion rand in terms of improving the infrastructure, but in terms of the goodwill that was generated out of the World Cup, I don't know what price you'd give it.
It's invaluable. I've seen various discussions around it. I've seen people who've tried to put a value to say if we were to put in a marketing budget for that, you'd spend $500 million plus. And I've seen figures that go up to 700 billion in rand terms. And so it's very difficult to put a valuation to it because it's an immense contribution to a country's image.
Absolutely. So in terms of where we stand now and what you would change in the kind of work that you're doing every day now, maybe let's just go through the plan that you have in terms of trying to position South Africa as you pay your mandate as a leading trade and investment destination, as also as a tourism destination.
Well, what we would change, and this is where we are now focused,
Sure.
is to position and profile South Africa more and more as a business destination. And the reason for this is that South Africa is really well known now as a tourism destination. The World Cup also helped that, but the significant marketing we're doing of South Africa as a tourism destination has helped that. So from a culture point of view, from a point of view of our prowess and achievements in sports, as well as from the perspective of just heritage, South Africa is well known. What we now need to do is to move South Africa from a destination which is known to a destination that the world wants to do business with. So a greater focus on really profiling and positioning South Africa as an inward investment destination, as a business destination, a destination for trade, and more importantly also a destination that will attract talent.
And how difficult is that? I would imagine the competition must be immense, because we all know about the story around Nigeria and how Nigeria is going to become the leading economy of Africa. And as you've just said, in terms of that calculation, that's based on the size of your GDP.
Quite clearly, the environment is going to become increasingly competitive. In fact, it is now. As you're saying, there are other economies on the continent that are coming up. You mentioned Nigeria, you have other economies like Ghana. But we have no doubt that South Africa has a very good, strong foothold. And we have, I think, a very good start in terms of really being able to position ourselves very strongly and be able to increase or contribute to the increase in inward investment. Also contribute to two-way trade between ourselves and the target countries that we are working with. Yeah,
let's perhaps give our viewers here a sense of the kind of people that you're competing against as Brand South Africa on the African continent. South Africa is, of course, the biggest economy, so given the correlation between the brand and GDP, so South Africa necessarily becomes the number one. It follows that South Africa becomes the number one brand in Africa. Who's next? And behind them, who is there?
Well, South Africa is number one in the world. Well, number one on the continent. Sorry. Okay. In the world, we rank 34th. And right behind us come countries such as Egypt, Nigeria, Morocco, if you look at some of the top 5 countries. Sure. So you can see that there's quite a lot of competition coming up on the continent.
Yeah. Before we talk about Africa, should we be higher in the world at number 34? In your view, is the world fairly valuing Brand South Africa?
I think there is always an element of discounting when it comes to emerging markets or even countries that are on the continent. I would believe that probably South Africa would value a lot higher than that. There is always the issue that we call the issue of continental branding, where we tend to be associated largely with the negatives on the continent and not so much with the positives. And there are a lot of positives. So I think inherently somewhere in the market there is a bit of discounting. But if you look at our companies in South Africa that are now spreading throughout the continent and into other parts of the world, I think future valuations will really begin to reflect the true value of South Africa's brand equity.
Yeah, we know the Johannesburg Stock Exchange it vacillates between 15, 16, 17, 18, but certainly below that top 20 mark in terms of market capitalization in the world. I would like to change the methodology and have it based on the size of your market cap, because then that enables South Africa to jump 14 places.
I think that would add quite a bit, obviously, to South Africa's valuation. Sure. But if you're talking about the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, I think a thought for you here would be the fact that if you look at the global competitiveness rankings, in fact, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange ranks as number 1 in the world in terms of the regulation of the securities exchange. Indeed. It's one of those that rank amongst, in fact, it's number 1. So which begins to tell you the story if you now look at that value as well in terms of the GCI, as I've just explained. Yeah. It really means you could find a much higher valuation from a country point of view if you take into account the output of not only the firms but also our securities exchange.
Yeah. So let's talk about those factors that take down South Africa's ranking in the world and valuation in the world. What are they, and what are you guys doing to address them?
Well, if I take one of the key areas, which is an area that is very close to my heart, is the area of education. Sure. If you look at education and skills, that's an area that we need to build upon. And it's encouraging to see that South Africa and actually the government is starting to place a lot of emphasis on that area. Sure. But if you take our secondary and tertiary, let's take tertiary enrollment, for instance, which is just under 20% at 15%. Right. It tells you that we need to do a little bit more. Now, what are we doing about it as Brand South Africa? Yeah. We believe it's important, and therefore that's why we partner, for example, with, amongst others, the Department of Education. We partnered, for example, with them when they launched the Quality Learning and Teaching campaign in the Eastern Cape. But on an ongoing basis, we try to support campaigns that will help enhance the quality of education in the country, because we understand that that is very important for our competitiveness ultimately, and also for our development as a country.
Yeah. How valuable is this branding business in terms of trying to attract business to South Africa? And it's a two-part question here. That's the first part. The second part is there a recognition and realization within government that what we do and what we say and when we pronounce it has an impact on how we stand and are seen in terms of the world context?
I think there's a recognition of that, increasingly so. And it's becoming more apparent when you start to realize that, you know, the issue of branding and branding a country is very important and is integral to your efforts to position yourself as a destination for investment, as a tourism destination, because it's not just a question of working on the fundamentals, whether it's macroeconomic fundamentals, or you have to work on the image as well.
Yeah.
So perceptions play a critical role in how a country ultimately benefits or does not benefit from business, from trade. So I think there's an increasing understanding of that within government, and I think the kind of support that you're starting to see really shows that there is an appreciation of the relevance of nation brand building.
Right. And in terms of my first question, just how valuable it is in this branding thing in terms of trying to position the country against other competitors in the world. What kind of a difference does it make?
It does make a difference because, in fact, you know, some studies have shown the correlation between perceptions about the country as well as how then it becomes seen as attractive for investment, or even as a destination that attracts talent. Right. Because if people have a negative perception or image of a country, I think very few of them would tend to want to either go and live there or transfer their skills into that country or even start doing business with them. So there's a very close correlation between, you know, the building of a country's image and brand and reputation and the tangibles of people investing in that country. And we've seen it happening throughout the world.
Which brings me to my next question, which is around the stakeholders and the people that you have to work with in terms of trying to build brand South Africa. You work with, of course, with the business sector. The government works also with the business sector. But what about the politicians? Do you work with them? Do they understand their role in terms of trying to build brand South Africa?
Well, we do work with them to the extent that we account ourselves to Parliament through the Portfolio Committee. So we do present our work to them. Sure. And we do present the challenges, obviously, that we come across in doing the work that we are doing. Yeah. And increasingly, as I said, there is a recognition of the role that functions such as ours and an organization such as Brand South Africa and what it can do. So yes, we do work with them to that extent. However, I think increasingly what we should see going forward is probably to have also that one-on-one and direct engagement with political parties. You talked about the issue of pronouncements and what impact those might have on the perceptions about the country or the image. And so in terms of our strategy going forward, we plan to have far more engagement with civil society, with business, and with government around targeted issues that affect brand reputation.
What about now in your conversations with them? Do they understand the kind of damage that they do to brand South Africa with their pronouncements?
Oh, definitely, yes. I do believe that there is a greater understanding of what certain pronouncements or what would happen if certain conversations that are really not based on fact are allowed to carry on. Yeah. And I think that is coming through, as I said, in our engagements with government or when we even account to Parliament. I think some of the key questions that are raised actually highlight the fact that there is very great awareness. I mean, one of the questions that for instance, came up was who are the people we use as brand ambassadors? Right. And that came up, you know, from parliamentarians. And we said, well, that's part of our program. Going forward, we would like to draw on a number of people who will be ambassadors for the brand, who will be able to articulate what South Africa stands for positively as well as objectively. And so that's the intent that we have. And I think for me, that conversation points to the fact that there is an understanding of the fact that what pronouncements people make, if not responsible sometimes, have an impact on brand reputation and image.
Let me ask you a difficult question. The Minister of Mines, Susan Shabangu, has been on record as saying that the talk around nationalization is damaging the investment prospects of South Africa as a country. And we know that nationalization is part of the national conversation now because it's been brought in by the ANC Youth League. Has it had an impact in terms of the standing of Brand SA?
Well, we haven't really sought to quantify that. Our assessments and talking to the markets is that, yes, it is a factor that has come up in conversations. Yes, it does create a certain level of uncertainty on the part of investors. But we haven't really been able to quantify that and say you have had this particular investment prospect being withdrawn as a direct result of that. Now, I think that is something that we need to be very careful about, because I think part of what you need in terms of attracting investment is you need to have certainty. If you look at the mining industry, for example, you find that the planning horizons as well as the investment horizons are over 20, 30-year periods. And so people would like to have a certain level of certainty. And it does not mean that investors do not assess risk. They assess risk, but they want to understand what are the more immediate risks that are there and what is the certainty, particularly around issues such as regulatory environment, around the rules that of the game in the particular country. So I think that's the area where we need to create a lot more certainty. The issue of the debate and the discussion, that comes through, as I believe, as part of our democracy as a country.
I was actually going to say that's a value that also enhances the brand value of Brand South Africa, but we must continue that conversation after the break, because we now must take indeed a break, and when we come back, we'll be asking the question, who is Mila Matola?